ignition switches. On. RPM switches. Set. TD switches. Normal. Doors and hatches. Closed. Light out. Strobe light. On. Restart check is complete. Clear left. Engineers, start number 2. Starting 2. Wind 31010, Pilot Project Podcast. Clear takeoff. Runway 31 left.
All right, we're ready for departure here at the Pilot Project Podcast, the best source for stories and advice from RCAF and mission aviation pilots, brought to you by Skies Magazine. I'm your host, Brian Morrison, and with me today is Mike Reyno, publisher and owner of Vertical, Valor, Vertical Marketplace, Skies, RCAF Today, eVTOL.com, Insight Magazines, and Vertical MRO Conference, all under MHM Publishing. Today, for part 2 of our chat, we'll be talking about Mike's career as well as MHM's foray into the podcasting world. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Does any trip stand out to you as a highlight from your time flying in the RCAF? And if so, why?
So there's a couple that did. One, I'll go back to, that flight I did with 401 Squadron and the 60th anniversary of NORAD. That was definitely one that stood out.
Yeah, of course.
There was another flight that I did that was actually, it was an interesting flight, and it was called Amalgam Warrior. So this is where they would do the, it was part of the NORAD training exercises they would do. And this one was out at Cold Lake. And I was flying with 434 Squadron. So VU-32 disbanded, and then it morphed into what was 434 Combat Support Squadron. And then they were based at Shearwater, and then they eventually moved over to Greenwood. So I was invited to go along, and it was T-Birds, F-18s, Challengers, and then the Americans had B-52s. They had some of their fighters. And so at that time, basically what 434 Squadron would do is that they would do things like they would simulate cruise missiles. So the T-Bird was the perfect profile to simulate a cruise missile. So, you would come up under a wing of a Challenger, and then you were basically launched like a cruise missile.
Oh, cool.
And then it would be for the fighters to intercept you, or for radar to track you. And on this mission, what it was is the T-Birds were acting kind of like as like an aggressor, like the bad guys. And the Challengers were involved, and then you had the F-18s. So we do the briefing, and we launch it. And I believe on this mission, there was 4 T-Birds and a Challenger that were on it. And it's wintertime, so you're wearing the immersion, all the winter gear, and it's a tight squeeze. I'm a small guy, and it was a tight squeeze for me in the back of the T-Bird. So we launch out of Goose Bay. And we're flying, and I'm excited because this is the first time I'm going to be photographing. We had everything set up. We're photographing these F-18s with the B-52 bombers, with the T-Birds. We had everything planned out. Well, as we're flying, I lose comms with the pilot. So one of the things that we always went through is, we never went into what sort of hand signals that you should use if you lose comms. So I'm trying to get the pilot's attention in the mirrors.
Yeah.
Because I can hear him. He can't hear me. I don't know what to do. So I'm waving my arms in the back of the T-Bird. He's asking me questions, and I've got my head down because now I'm tracing the comm cords, and I'm trying to see, is it disconnected or anything? But all he can see is my head is down, and I'm waving my arms. To me, I'm waving my arms to say, hey, I can hear you. And I'm going like this, like something's wrong. Well, next thing I know, and we're probably in the low 20s, 20,000 feet or something like that. And all of a sudden, we roll upside down, and we head down for the deck. And all he can see is, again, I'm waving my arms in the mirror, and I'm looking up, and I see all these aircraft starting to form formation off the bombers. And we get down, and we land, pops the canopy, and he's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm fine. I don't have comms." He said, "I thought you were going hypoxic."
Oh,
so that was why we had to get on the ground, and I missed what would probably been at that time the ultimate photo shoot of all time.
Oh man,
it had never been done. That I would have had all these aircraft together, and of course, it was a one-time opportunity, and I never got to do it again. So that one was quite memorable. I also was fortunate to do a couple of operational missions. I did Operation Sharp Guard. So that was over in the Adriatic, and that was 405 Squadron was flying out of Sigonella in Italy.
Yep.
And so I was invited to go over and fly and cover, what the Auroras were doing when we were over there. And I was actually given the ability to fly on an operational mission, which was quite interesting. At the time, if I recall, the Auroras were doing most of their flying at night, and they were monitoring the illegal shipment of weapons that they were trying to smuggle in coming out of Italy.
Okay.
And they caught a go fast coming out of, I forget where it was in Italy, but they got this go fast coming out. And as you know, being a former Aurora pilot, of the capabilities of the Aurora, and they started tracking one.
And just for the audience, I just want to explain quickly, a go fast is just a fast moving boat usually used for smuggling.
I forget I shouldn't be using all these military terms, but I should explain what it is. And so we're coming up on this go fast. And I don't know if the Aurora still has it today, but in that day they had that flash illumination system that they would use on the Aurora so they could take a picture at night. And we came over that go fast. I don't even know if we were 200 feet, and that flash illumination system went off, and the boat just started going everywhere. They had no idea that we were there. But it was a pretty fascinating mission because, off in the distance you could see the artillery. You could see the artillery that was hitting. But we stayed over the Adriatic the whole time. But that was, I believe, at that time they were flying. I think they were 8-hour missions is what we were doing. So that was something I was fortunate to be part of, was to go up on an operational mission.
That's cool. Of course, that's my squadron. My old squadron is 405 Squadron. So that's pretty cool that you got a chance to go flying with them, especially operationally. Like I don't know if we would still do that. I think it'd be tough in general to get media on board an Aurora just because of all the secret systems and stuff that are on board. I think that's a very unique experience.
Yeah, it's certainly changed, with the systems that are there on board the Aurora. Over the years, though, I haven't personally been involved, but for people that work for us, so our writers and photographers, we've gone to Mali with the RCAF. We are embedded with Chinooks and Griffins in Mali. And we also did a big feature on operations in Afghanistan.
Wow.
So I had a team that was over there for, I believe it was almost 2 weeks that we were in Afghanistan, that we were flying embedded with the Chinooks and Griffins over there as well.
Wow. That must have been quite an experience.
It was incredible. And again, it goes to the trust that the RCAF has with us, with the brands that we have. So, and they know that we self-edit what we put out.
Right.
So, there are certain things that obviously we get to see that a lot of people wouldn't normally get to see, but we know what we can put out there and what we can't put out there. So, like, we're not going to put out information that shouldn't be for people to see.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we have such a good relationship with the RCAF, is that we already know. And for all intents and purposes, it's almost like we're part of the Air Force when we're doing these things. Like, I already know what we can and cannot do, what we can and cannot show. So that's always worked out very well.
Yeah. So you obviously love flying. Do you have a pilot's license?
So you probably find this funny is that, and I get this asked this question a lot, and people assume that I do, but I actually don't have a pilot's license. I honestly never had this big calling to be a pilot. Mine was that I wanted to cover the aviation and aerospace sectors. That was what my interest was, but it wasn't to fly. I mean, I've flown almost every aircraft I've flown in. I've had stick time, like anyone would, for 5 or 10 minutes or whatever. But no, I'm actually not a pilot.
Huh. Well, there you go. So keen listeners will have noticed that a large number of your publications are helicopter based. Where did that love affair with helicopters begin?
Well, I guess it actually started with that first flight with 423 Squadron. That's where it started. And when it goes back to where I was saying, I flew a lot with a lot of the squadrons that didn't get the sort of attention that, say, the fighter squadrons were getting. The fighter guys were always getting the attention. Whereas I picked those squadrons that, hey, they don't get the sort of attention that they deserve. And a lot of that was in the helicopter communities. So the TACHEL community, for example, it's not as sexy as being a fighter pilot. The mission they do is incredible. So it was being able to tell those stories. But the more I got involved with helicopters, especially in the civil world, the more interesting they became. And the helicopter is really, it's an engineering marvel. When you look at what they can do, the number of missions that they can do, and now I'm not talking about military, I mean, that's one thing, but I'm talking about in the civilian world. So you can let's take a Bell 412, which is the Griffin. Okay, so this is based off, you can take that Griffin and you could probably come up with 30 different missions that aircraft could do. If you take a transport aircraft, let's say it's like a caravan. So a caravan's either going to carry passengers, it's going to carry cargo, it might do ISR, but not too many other missions.
Yeah.
But you could take that 412. That 412 can be equipped for doing aerial firefighting. It can be equipped for doing air medical. Then it could be going out and it could be doing moving drills for mining and mineral exploration, what they do. So they'll move drills. There's so many missions that you can take that a helicopter can do. And it's fascinating. And the community within for helicopters, when you see the level of ingenuity of what they come up with, of what you can do with a helicopter, it's incredible. It's almost endless. So that's where, when I started to learn more about the civil world of helicopters, that's where it became more fascinating. I remember my first civil story that I did for helicopters was actually, it was helilogging on Vancouver Island. I was coming back, I was doing an air-to-air shoot with Transport Canada. They had this beautiful DC-3 that I had just photographed. And as we're landing at the airport, I see these two BV-107s, which is the civilian version of the Labrador helicopter that the Canadian Air Force flew.
Yep.
The Lab. This is the civilian version of it. And I see these two helicopters going by, and I'm like, what the hell are these? So I asked when we got down, and I see them sitting there, and it says Helifor on the side. Never heard of them. And so I started making inquiries. And there was a gentleman there, his name was Jeff Briggs. So he was responsible for operations for Helifor, and they were doing helilogging with these helicopters. I had no idea that you could use helicopters to log.
Yeah.
So it goes back to, well, if you don't ask the question, you'll never find out if you can do it. So I made a connection with Jeff, and I said, "Yeah, we'd love to do a story on helilogging." And they took me out, and they had one of these helicopters out there logging, and the 107, they're lifting about 9,000 pounds of wood at a time, roughly about that, depending on altitude that they're logging on Vancouver Island. And it was amazing watching these pilots fly with a 150 to a 200 foot long line below a helicopter, grabbing logs off the side of a mountain. And that's where I started to see the world of helicopters and be fascinated with all these different missions that they can do. And there's still new missions that they're creating with them. I mean, one of the new missions that helicopters are doing now is that we're getting workers down on the top of the windmills that are offshore. Those windmills have to be serviced.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to go by boat, but they're using helicopters now. So it's a new sector that they've created for helicopters, that this is how they're getting people down, or using helicopters to put the pilot boat captains onto ships offshore. They're doing that off the west coast of Vancouver Island. They're also doing off the west coast of the United States. It's kind of new for Canada. We only just started doing that. The first contract only came in a couple months ago. But in Europe, this has been something they've been doing a lot. This is how they're getting the pilot boat captains down to ships that are coming into whatever port.
Okay.
So it's fascinating when you see what they can do with a helicopter.
Yeah, just super versatile.
It's versatile. It is a helicopter is the most versatile aircraft ever developed.
Hmm.
When you go to a show, and give you an example is that you look at a Sikorsky S-92, which the Cyclone is basically built from, is an S-92. That helicopter was designed to be an offshore oil and gas transporter of people. Fly offshore workers to oil rigs. That was what it's designed for. And of course, Canada is the only military in the world to fly it as the Cyclone in the mission it flies. I mean, the VH-92 is flying the President of the United States now. But now, because of this ingenuity, the S-92s, they're in that 20-year-old range. They're taking them, and now they're converting them into doing aerial firefighting.
Oh, wow.
VIH helicopters out on Vancouver Island, they've taken an S-92 and they've put a belly tank on it that can carry, I believe it's 6,000 liters of water. And now they can go fight fires with it.
Wow.
It was a mission that helicopter was never designed for. And you see that now too, even with Blackhawks that are being sold from the US Army that are going into civilian hands in the United States. There's a handful now that are flying in Canada. They're doing missions that Sikorsky or the US military never envisioned that those helicopters would be doing.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it is that public safety type stuff. They're doing if it's utility work or they're doing search and rescue with those aircraft. So it's that level of ingenuity that you see in that helicopter sector that you just don't see that anywhere else.
Yeah, for sure. So what's the best experience you've ever had as an air-to-air photographer?
I would actually say it was with 442 Squadron in Comox. There was a pilot there, Jean-Francois Dupont, who is now the commanding officer of 431 Squadron, better known as Snowbirds. He was a photographer, a great photographer. So that's how we kind of connected, was as photography. And I had met him briefly when he was on the Snowbirds, not as the boss, but when he was on the Snowbirds earlier. And we just connected because of the photography. And when he left the Snowbirds, he actually went from fixed wing to flying the Cormorant. And with Vertical magazine is very well known amongst the rotary wing community. And he invited us out. He said, listen, he goes, come on out to 442 and we'll do some stories. And at that time, we had one of our writers, a gentleman by the name of Rob Erdos. Rob was retired RCAF. He had flown Labradors, but he also came as from the RCF. He went to the National Research Council of Canada, and he was the chief pilot of Rotary there. So as a test pilot, Rob had the pedigree that the RCF would let him fly aircraft that we could put him in. So we came up with this idea. Let's put Rob in the Cormorant to fly it. And then we did a story about Rob flying the Cormorant. Well, as part of that, we needed to gather as much photo and video content as we could. And so the squadron OPSO basically put us on every mission that they were doing with the Cormorant. Every training mission, we went on the Cormorant. And so we did some amazing photography. And the weather, we were there in end of April, and it was unseasonably warm. There wasn't a cloud in the sky over Comox for the whole week that we were there.
Beautiful.
And we flew around Mount Washington. We were landing at the top of Mount Washington, like all these areas that we were going. It was just an incredible flight. The SAR-techs were amazing. We'd pick a spot to land, and the SAR-techs, they're the ones that are looking after us in the back of the aircraft, and they did everything to help us. But it was just an incredible experience because the areas that we were flying in, I think I mentioned earlier, is that, in a plane, you're going to fly over it. You can look at it and say, oh, that looks pretty.
Yeah.
In a helicopter, you fly over it, you land, you experience it. And that's what we were doing with the Cormorant. We landed in so many different types of environment where the Cormorant would do search and rescue missions. So that would go down, I would say, probably the best experience I ever had. I believe in a 2-day period, I flew almost 11 hours in a Cormorant.
That's a lot of time in 2 days.
It was a lot of time, but it was great. And it's not like the old days. The old days, you would set up a photo shoot, and they're like, okay, we're going out for a photo X. That's what it was. Nowadays, it's like we have a training mission. We'll allow you to come along with us. Yeah. And you just get what you can get. We might have a few minutes. We can do some air-to-air photography, but you get what you can get. So that's what we did during those flights. They kept on putting us on the training missions, and we just got everything that we could. And it's content that we continue to use today. So it's that was an incredible flight.
That's awesome. What is the scariest experience you've ever had as an air-to-air photographer?
So, one of the things that you learn when you're doing this is you listen. You listen to what people have to tell you. You listen to when the pilots are telling you, and you learn, the capabilities of an aircraft. What one aircraft can do. So you're flying in an F5, you're photographing an F-18. They can't do the same. They don't have the same performance to be able to do certain missions. So you listen a lot to this. So when you would do the missions, I would always have, Mike, what do you want to do? So I'd have a brief. This is how we want to do things. So because of the briefings and what I learned how to identify when to shut something down. If something's not going the way, and I thought maybe this isn't safe, I would never hesitate in speaking up. And it was very rare that I would ever do that if I didn't feel comfortable with something. So, and that was because we did these briefings. We always did a good briefing on things. But probably the most scariest experience I had was actually flying with the Snowbirds. And that was 2001. And again, it was back at the London Air Show. And I was one of the Snowbird photographers. So at that time, the Snowbirds had a handful of people that they would fly that were considered a Snowbird photographer. So I'd be contracted by the Snowbirds to fly with them at a show to capture whatever imagery I could that then the Snowbirds would then own. So it was London Air Show, and I was asked to be part of the media flight, which was on the Friday before the air show would start. So we do the briefing, and at that time, Major Bob Péchon was he was the boss, cowboy, and I was flying in Snowbird number 5, which was Warren Wright whiskey. And I had flown with the Snowbirds at that time, probably at least a half a dozen, if not more, times by the time the London Air Show came. So we did the brief with, so you had media personalities were flying in the other jets, and I was going to be flying in number 5, which is in the back of the diamond formation, is where where I was slated to fly. So as a Snowbird photographer, when we're doing the mission, they would ask, okay, Mike, is there anything that you want? Well, at that time, there was a brief time where the Snowbirds were doing a 3-year tour versus the 2. And it was Cowboy's last year. And I had flown with Cowboy when he was in F-18s. I think I did 1 or 2 photo shoots with Cowboy. And I said, well, let's get some shots of Cowboy on his own. This is his last year. And they're like, yeah, no problem. And we brief it. Now, I left at that point because they knew what we'd be after. We weren't doing anything that was going to be crazy. And then we kind of left it at that. So we go out to the jets, and everything is normal. We go up, we do the mission, and we start. And when the Snowbirds move, you've got 9 jets that are trying to move at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a domino effect. One starts to move, then the others have to move. So keep in mind, Cowboy's in the front of the diamond, we're in the back of the diamond. Cowboy calls for a formation change because he's going to come out of the formation, and my jet number 5 is going to come out of the formation, and we're going to go off on our own to do some photos. It's a standard procedure. There was nothing that was different about the radio call. So we go off to do the photos. And when you start to get involved in aerobatics, that's where things can go wrong very quickly. So we're set up. We're over Lake Erie. Cowboys, we've got him going inverted. We've got him going straight up. We're doing all these different types of formations, probably in a period of, it was like maybe 10 minutes. And then we call for the formation, we break, and then we join up with the rest of the Snowbirds. So I'm talking with Whiskey, and it's like, yeah, I got what I needed. And at that time, the humidity was building up over the lake, so you're starting to get that high cumulus cloud, and it was starting to get overcast. And I thought we were only doing the one breakaway for those photos. And then Cowboy made the radio call. He said to do the formation change again. And I said to Whiskey, I said, I got what I need. And when Whiskey made the radio call to Cowboy, he said, too late, because it goes back to the team was starting to change formation.
Okay.
So all the jets had already started to move. So we were like, okay, let's go out and do the photos again. So we did it again. And then on the last photo, Cowboy split away from the formation. Whiskey and I were, just like any other time I was flying, the Snowbirds, the rest of the formation was probably 4 miles away from us. We're literally just talking. Did you get the photos you need? Yep. And we heard the rejoin. So we heard Cowboy come over the radio and basically called for the rejoin. I had flown with the Snowbirds enough that I could understand, when you call certain rejoins, the jargon that's used. And I understood the rejoin the same way that Whiskey understood the rejoin. However, what later came down, it was the lingo that was used. Whiskey came from transports. Cowboy was a fighter pilot.
Okay.
So it was misunderstood. We thought to rejoin the formation of Snowbirds, the call was to rejoin on Cowboy. So as we're talking, we're literally flying straight and level. At the last second, we saw the bottom of Cowboy. We saw the Speedbird, which is the bottom of the Tudor. He's in a flat turn, coming at us in a left-hand turn. I'm sitting on the right side of the jet. And we saw it at the last second that we bunted enough, because I feel if Whiskey didn't bunt, he might have come through the cockpit. So Cowboy came across our wing. We ripped off his tail. He took off about 4 or 5 feet of our leading edge.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, they had to eject. So this is over Lake Erie. He had a passenger with him. It was a sergeant who, what saved his life was the fact that he was a former airborne, because when he ejected out of the aircraft, I believe they were at, I want to say we were under 2,000 feet.
Oh, wow.
And the parachute just came out of the pack when he hit the water. So Cowboy, he ejected, no injuries. Unfortunately, his passenger, he had several injuries. But even with those injuries, that passenger, and the swells in the lake were probably like lake swells. Like you're not talking white caps, but it was enough that you can't see. So they couldn't see each other. But that passenger his instincts kicked in, even with his injuries, and he started looking for the pilot. He's trying to find the pilot, and make sure the pilot was okay.
Oh, wow.
So to try to find Cowboy. So anyway, a Labrador happened to be in Hamilton doing a search and rescue demo with the fire department. They got the pan call, which is the call when you have an aircraft go down. And from going into the water to when the Labrador was overhead, I believe was about 45 minutes, which was incredibly fast. Because if they were coming from Trenton, it would have been a lot longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, we managed to, the dash on the Tudor just lit up red.
Yeah.
And, but we managed to get back. There was no issues, but one of the pilots, they were trying to find us, but going back to that, it was overcast and we were pumping smoke so they could see us, so they could do a once over on us to see if there was any additional damage. They couldn't find us. So we made it back to London. It was maybe a 15-minute flight to get back to London. It felt like 2 hours.
No kidding.
To get on the ground. But that was by far the scariest moment. But I would say it was probably, had I known then what I know now, it was probably a dark time for me in the Air Force.
Yeah.
Because what happened at that time is, the Snowbirds all came together to look after their teammates, which they should. But I was a civilian and I was offered nothing. I'm not talking about monetary. I'm talking about just help. I mean, back in those days, you didn't talk about things like PTSD and all that kind of stuff. Like there was nothing.
Yeah. And you had just been through this like traumatic experience.
I had just been through this traumatic experience. I landed and I won't say who the guy was on the team. There was only one person in the Air Force I never got along with. And it was this one particular pilot. And he would not let me call my wife.
Oh, wow.
And then we had some words exchanged, and I did call her because she had just heard it on the radio that there was a crash with the Snowbirds.
Yeah. So
I would say that was where I really considered, do I continue doing what I'm doing? I was mad at the Air Force because I had nothing. My conversation with the Air Force was at the accident investigation. There was no resources that were provided to me. The those resources provided to me should have been the same resources that were provided to anyone else on that team. And there was nothing because I was a civilian at that time. But I know that now. Back then, I'm this kid that's, is what am I going to do?
Yeah.
So that was a tough time. And I didn't know, could I continue to do this? I didn't know if the Air Force would say, hey, Mike, you're the cause of this, because I was the one that asked for that photo.
Right.
But it was no different than you do in every other photo shoot. Right. But it took me a month. I believe it was a month before I got into the air, but that was only with the blessing of Linda that she said, okay, but you cannot fly with the Snowbirds again.
Yeah.
So it took a month. And actually in that month, the Air Force called me up and said, hey, we've got an exercise we want you to be part of up in, it was back in Goose Bay.
No kidding.
And to be honest with you, I was shocked. I figured that the Air Force would never fly me again. And it was within a month I was in a backseat of a T-Bird again.
How did you manage to push through and get back in the cockpit?
It was one of those things, it's one of those, it can't happen to me again.
Okay.
Like you have that in your head. Well, it's not, I can't happen to me twice.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of it. And I think it would have been different had you had access to the sort of resources where you keep on being reminded by, everything you see on social media. We didn't have social media back then, right? So we didn't have those things that kept on reminding you about it other than just what you remembered. So I think when I went on that first flight, it was just a little apprehensive when we started getting into the close formation. But again, it was, briefing that mission to make sure. And what was interesting is that when we flew, I remember the pilot saying, "Oh, we didn't realize you were the one that was flying in the with the Snowbirds."
Yeah.
But it was great. Those guys at 434 Squadron. I mean, they really helped you to get through it all, and then after that, I never looked back again.
Wow. I can't imagine going through that. That must have been really, really challenging. So how did you make the jump into the publishing space? Can you tell us more about that story?
Yeah. So when I was editor of Wings and Helicopters, they were based in Calgary. I was living in Kitchener, Ontario. And the publisher at the time, Paul Skinner, decided he was going to sell the magazines. So he sold them to a company in Ontario. And what happened is when it was sold, basically anyone that was full-time with the company, minus myself, they were all let go. But I was kept on because I was the one that had the aviation knowledge and the aviation experience.
Right.
But the company that bought us knew nothing about aviation. They bought us just because we happened to be an aviation magazine and they made money. That's how they looked at it. They had
okay.
Probably 30 different brands in all different sectors of the industry. And that's why they acquired us. But soon after I started, I didn't like it. I didn't like the new company. I didn't like their direction. I didn't like what the future was. And I was the only guy there. I was very passionate about aviation, and we did things for a reason when I was at Wings and Helicopters, and they wanted to change that because they thought they knew better because they do pharmaceutical magazines or they did vending machine magazines, and whatever applied there applied to aviation, which it does not. So I basically didn't get along with them, and I was now starting to dislike what I was doing. But Linda and I wanted to get into business of our own for quite some time. Linda comes from a family of 8 brothers and sisters, and almost all of them had husband and wife businesses. They all worked together, and we wanted to do the same. So basically, push came to shove, and I said, "That's it." I called Linda. I was at a trade show. It was a helicopter trade show, and I called Linda and I said, "You know what? I don't want to do this anymore, but I want to do it if we can do it together. Let's launch our own helicopter magazine." And the reason why we decided to go helicopters is that there wasn't much in the way of competition in the magazine world, in the world of helicopters. And it goes back to where I felt that helicopters, it was an underserviced market for getting that media attention. And it's a fascinating sector of the industry to cover. So, our girls were we're young. We're even a year old. And she's like, okay, so you want to start a business right now and put everything on the line? And I said, yeah. And so we made that decision. And it was Labor Day weekend of 2002 is when MHM Publishing was launched. That's when I had left my previous employer, and we launched MHM Publishing, MHM being Mitchell, Hannah, Madison. So everyone always asks, what's MHM mean? Well, that's my kids, which I'm happy to say that all three of my kids now work for MHM Publishing.
That's awesome.
Mitchell, so Mitchell is in sales. Skies is more of his portfolio. My daughter, Hannah, she is a designer. She only joined us about 6 months ago, and she just designed her first Valor magazine. And then my other daughter, Madison, she comes from the communications world, and she just joined us, and she's involved. She handles all our social media channels, and she's going to be involved in our MRO conferences that we're doing. So it just factored out. It was never planned that my kids would be part of the company. And my brother also works for me. He does a lot of the editing and helping on the Helicast side of everything. So it truly is a family business. But when we launched, Vertical was that first magazine that we decided to go with. But what made it different is we said, we're going to make this a North American publication. So it's going to be Canadian and American. A lot of the industries across the border, they have a lot of similarities between each other. And a lot of those aircraft go back and forth across the border on contracts. So it didn't exist, and that's what we created. And after the first magazine, so typically in the world of publishing, it could take up to 2 years before you have a profitable publication. We did it in one issue. So from that one issue, we knew we had something when we launched that. The thing that was interesting is that when we launched, we came up with the name Vertical, something different. So one of the things to keep in mind is everything we always did was something that was different. We didn't want to be the same. We didn't want to have a helicopter in the name. So we came up with Vertical. But those first phone calls we made in the US, they kept on saying, you're from Vertigo? We're like, no, Vertical. And so for a while they were like, did we maybe pick the wrong name? But then it caught on. So after that first issue, it snowballed.
So you said it started to snowball. How did you manage to grow MHM Publishing's portfolio to such a large degree?
Two things. Listen. So we listen to the audience, and two, surround yourself with an amazing team. So, and I think that's as a small business, that's where it doesn't matter what you do. Small businesses fail because, they'll either micromanage or they bring in the wrong people to be part of a team. For us, we've been incredibly fortunate to surround ourselves with an amazing group of people. By listening, we listened, and then we had Vertical. And then there was a calling that people said, hey, it'd be great to have a helicopter magazine that was dedicated to public safety and the military. So search and rescue, air medical, firefighting, and the military and airborne law enforcement. So then we launched, at that time it was Vertical 911. It's now called Valor. And then people started to ask us, can you guys get back into the fixed wing world? Then we launched Skies. So Skies was, I had always wanted to get back into the fixed wing side of things. So then we launched Skies. And then once we had Skies, then the Air Force, because I had a hiatus of the Air Force for about 6 or 7 years where I really wasn't doing that much with the Air Force. Well, all those people that I was dealing with in the Air Force that were lieutenants or captains said now they're majors, lieutenant colonels, and higher. So when I picked up the phone and called those people and said, hey, I'm going to launch RCAF today, it just picked back up again where we left off. So then we launched RCAF today. And then we got into trade publication Insight. And then we started to blossom from there. But it really is by listening and by surrounding yourself with an amazing group of people, they'll allow you to grow. And we did. And we're 24 full-time people now. Our full-time people are located in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And then we probably have about 20 to 25 regular freelancers that are based around the world. And as I said earlier, the thing that I'm most proud about, that I should say that Linda and I are most proud about, is that our kids are now involved in this business. And that was never an intent that our kids would be involved. It just naturally happened that that they're involved. So the saying goes is that the writing was always on the wall with MHM Publishing because their names were there.
So recently you've launched into the podcast space. What made you decide to get into that arena?
So when COVID hit, what changes the way that people receive information, how they consume information? We're all used to getting print magazines. When COVID came, I mean, one of the first things that we did, probably more so because no one knew what was in store for us as a small business. So the first thing we did is we chopped print. We said that was the biggest expense. You're doing everything for the survival of your company. We said, okay, chop print. We already had digital magazines, so we weren't losing out in that area. But through COVID, that's when you started to see the popularity of podcasts start to show themselves.
Yeah, for
People
sure.
were consuming, they were consuming information differently. It wasn't just in that print medium. We are now more tied to social media. We are now more accepting of a digital publication. I mean, everything that we're getting now is coming across on a mobile device on our phone. So that's where we started to reevaluate and not looking at within aviation for ideas, because aviation, when it comes to, I would say media or public relations, things like that, it's probably 10 years behind regular industry. So what we looked at is that we looked outside of our industry and said, okay, what are some good examples of success and branching out into other ways of delivering the news, delivering information, and that's when we started to look at podcasts. We had been approached to do podcasts. I would say we were right in the middle of COVID, or on the tail end of COVID, and the time just wasn't right. We were like, no, this isn't right for us. And to be honest with you, I didn't know enough about it. How much would be involved in it. So I turned the person down and said, no, we're not going to do this. Fast forward about a year after COVID, and I get a call from a gentleman by the name of John Gray, who is the host of the Hangar Z podcast. And John had asked, he said, hey, Mike, I would love for you to be on the podcast to talk about Vertical and Valor magazine and what you're doing for the airborne law enforcement community. And initially I accepted the offer to be on it, but then it was explained to you before we started this podcast is that I typically don't like to take the spotlight on anything. I like to be in the backseat and I let everyone else take the spotlight. So I actually ended up declining John's request. But I said to John, John, I think what you're doing with the Hangar Z podcast, and his podcast is really focused more towards that airborne law enforcement community and delving it a little bit more into public safety. But that's where it really focused. And I said, but John, I think we can maybe work together on getting your podcast more exposure within the airborne law enforcement community. And John's retired from Ontario City Police Department, where he flew Airbus H-125 helicopters.
It's in California, right?
Yeah, sorry, Ontario, California. So outside of Los Angeles. And so we came up with an agreement, and we started, sharing his podcast through our channels. And then what happened, it was that it was going so well. We just said to John, we were like, John, why don't you just become part of us? And that's what we did. So we basically absorbed the Hangar Z podcast. And then John he's now a full-time employee with MHM Publishing. And now John is responsible for all the other podcasts, which are now 7 that he's managing, which now includes, the pilot project as part of our network of getting that information out there now. And it just it took off. We started to see that people love the podcasts. So then what we did from the Hangar Z podcast, then we came up with an idea that said, why don't we bring all these like-minded podcasts together under one channel? And that's when we launched the Vertical Helicast network, where we brought in helicopter-specific or rotorcraft-specific podcasts into that channel. So we approached Halsey Scheider, which is the helicopter podcast, Jason Quinn, or better known as Quinny, with the Rio Rescue.
Yep.
We partnered with them. They came in under the fold of Helicast, and then we launched the Vertical MRO podcast, which is relates to rotorcraft maintenance, repair, and overhaul. And then just recently, we launched the Flight Crew podcast in a partnership with Echo. So that is more dedicated towards that air medical side of the world for podcasts. And then, of course, now we come over to the pilot project, and with you leaving the RCAF, then we came up with something that we could work together. That how can we help you? How can we help each other with a podcast? How do you share this information? And this is where we see that podcasts are becoming a phenomenal outlet for getting that information out there. And it allows people to tell some pretty incredible stories where you can capture that, you can capture the enthusiasm, you can capture the emotion in someone's voice that you can't capture in an article. So things have changed, and that's where we're jumping on that bandwagon.
Yeah, and I feel super fortunate to be part of that. As I've been watching you guys kind of grow over the past couple of years. I spoke with John Gray kind of just after you guys had partnered, and he had nothing but great things to say about you and the organization. So it was really a no-brainer for me to look at partnering with you guys. We talked about this a little bit, but what are you hoping to accomplish by partnering with the Pilot Project podcast?
So there's a couple of different things that we look at with the Pilot Project podcast. I think one of the most important things is that what you're doing is you're sharing those stories of the RCAF. We want to help to get further exposure through our own channels, through the magazine, through online, through social media, to get that messaging out. But it's also now to look at, what other stories can we tell that are not specific to the RCAF.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of incredible things that are happening in the world of Canadian aviation. So we can talk about things that are, say, special mission related type operations. Prime example, Quebec has 2 CL-415 water bombers that were being used under contract with LA County Fire to help fight the fires. They've been there for almost 20 years, where they've been holding that contract. That would be a pretty interesting story to tell people about. Hey, did you know that there's these opportunities that you can be an aerial firefighting pilot? What about flying in the air medical community, fixed wing? We also look at contract opportunities where you have civilian contract pilots that are flying with, for example, the Dutch Coast Guard down in Curacao. They're flying there under contract with PAL. So there's some pretty interesting things that are happening in the world of Canadian aviation that the Air Force, obviously, that will still be the number one priority. But everyone now and then, it might be nice to kind of dabble into some of these other special mission type communities within Canadian aviation.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a super interesting opportunity to kind of expand some of our topics. And I'm really looking forward to learning how those other people do the business.
Awesome.
So you're a busy guy running a very successful publishing company. What is one thing you do to stay ready to do your job?
It comes down to what I said earlier. It's just listening. There's a lot of different facets of the industry that we're trying to cover. If you look at yourself with your previous career where you were flying the Aurora, your knowledge or your focus was on that community. Whereas I go from A to Z. So it's trying to make sure, like, how are you tracking what's going on in the RCAF? How are you tracking what's going on the maintenance, repair, and overhaul world within helicopters? How do you monitor what's going on in offshore oil and gas? Like, there's all these things that you have to try to cover. But what helps, it goes back to that team. So that team that we've surrounded ourselves with, as I tell people, you're only as successful as the people you surround yourself with. And that's where I really can't stress enough that we have surrounded ourselves with an amazing group of people that help, not help, they've been instrumental in allowing me to do what I do. I mean, this is a passion that it hasn't changed from when we first started doing this. I'm still excited about aviation today as I was when I started doing this or when I went to that first London Air Show. But it's because of those people that they allow us to do what we are. And when you hire someone, you give them a task. We hired you to do this. let them do what you hired them to do, and don't micromanage them. So that's really helped. I've got a great team of editors. I got a great team of photographers, and I think one of the best things, I've got an amazing partner in this. Having Linda, that's really what made this be successful. It's not I'm doing this on my own. No, this is a 50-50 between Linda and I. And Linda, she was all in when we started this. And what made it work is it was because I was doing that editorial side. I was doing the photography side. I was doing what people see. Linda was responsible for all the behind the scenes, making sure the business was running the way it should run, and things like that. So I can honestly say it would not be what it is today because of the people we surrounded ourselves with, but also because Linda and I are doing this together.
Yeah.
That's really key. And that's a rarity. It doesn't matter what you do in business, but to have a husband and wife that can work well together. I can honestly tell you, we started this business in 2002. We have not had an argument about this business.
That's awesome.
Because she just listens to me. No, I'm kidding, because that's no, I listen to her. It's just it's worked out.
Yeah.
It's worked out. We're very lucky with what we do.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I feel super fortunate to have Melissa, my wife, as the editor, and not just the editor, but she knows what we need to do. I can bounce ideas off of her. I can talk to her when I'm stressed about the projects that we're working on. Whatever it is, we get through it together, and it just makes it so much more enjoyable.
It does. And now it makes it even that much more enjoyable is that now that my kids are involved. And this was something that I tell the kids. I say, you will be the hardest workers here at this company. You're not working here because you're a Reno. You're working here because you earned that position. And that's one of the things that's hard too when you're a business owner, forgetting about what we do. But as a business owner, like, people think that it's a free pass when you see
family,
an owner's kid come in.
Yeah.
You see the family come into the business. No. And if anything, it was people that work here that were pushing to have them join the company because of what their skill set is. We were looking for people that had that skill set, and it just worked out naturally.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You've worked with a ton of pilots. What qualities have the best pilots had in your experience?
Okay, so this question can get me in trouble because there's a lot of different personalities that you deal with as pilots. Doesn't matter if you're in the Air Force or the civilian world. But I can honestly say it's those pilots that are, they're the humble pilots that they'll do anything to help you. They've always been great to work with. You do have pilots that I've flown with where they get in front of the camera and they want to show that, hey, I'm the best pilot that there is. But then you have to have the ability to push back and say, hey, I don't need you to do this.
Yeah.
I've had that happen a few times where I've gone, hey, we're going to stop right now because I don't need to know that you're the world's greatest pilot. But I've seen that, the helicopter guys and gals, they don't get that sort of acknowledgement that they deserve. But some of the best pilots are helicopter pilots. When you look at what they do,
for sure.
I remember I used to give some presentations to cadets. Okay. And they'd always want to talk about helicopters. But the first thing I would go in, I would say, who here wants to be a fighter pilot? And probably 80% of them put up their hand. And then you would go through who wants to fly transports, and then you get down to helicopter, and there'd be that one or two people that put up their hand, and they'd be embarrassed to put up their hand. I want to be a helicopter pilot. I would give my presentation about helicopters, and by the end of it, I had reversed it all. Where now everyone's putting their hand up. I want to be a helicopter pilot, right? It's a different community. It's a blue collar, white collar. That's kind of the ways I describe it as well, between the helicopter community and the fixed wing community. But I said I've flown with many pilots. I've flown with some truly amazing pilots. I've never been in a situation except once when a pilot made me nervous. So it's interesting. Like there's a lot of personalities that are out there that you fly with. But it's having the ability to identify that, okay, if you have, you have a pilot that's maybe wants to push things a little more because there's a camera or you're doing video, is that how you can kind of bring them back down to what you need. So having the ability to say no to some of the pilots also works for you.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying. I've said for a long time, the best pilots are humble professionals. And, the best pilots know that they're always learning and there's always going to be more to learn, and you're never going to be the best. So
But if you get to the point that you say you're the best, you might as well just finish your career.
yeah,
You're done.
hang up the keys.
Yep.
So there are a lot of amateur aviation photographers out there. What advice would you give to someone who wants to make the jump to doing it as a profession?
I think the number one thing is be different. There's so many times, like we have our annual photo contests between all the magazines. Between both magazines, we probably receive over 4,000 images.
Wow.
On the helicopter side, we always see a lot of different types of imagery just because of what helicopters are doing, the missions they do. They're not landing at an airport like you're watching airliners land at an airport and you're sitting at the end of a runway taking pictures. So it's a little different on the helicopter side, but on the fixed wing side, we constantly see the same thing. But all of a sudden I'll see something like, well, that's different. And that catches my attention. And that's why I say is that you look at what everyone else is doing and don't do that. Do something that you can create that's your own. What's your own signature? It's funny is that we probably have nearly 400,000 images on file here at MHM Publishing.
Wow.
I can look at an image and I know who the photographer is without having to look at a photo credit, because what I've learned is what their style is. How do they take a photo? So that's the biggest thing, is that be different in how you're approaching things, get different angles, be more creative with taking the photo. And I think the big thing today, now more than ever, is that what really gets our attention is that if you have the ability to also take video. So it goes back to, how people are receiving information. What are we seeing on social media, YouTube and things like that? And we're quite big on YouTube. So that also gets our attention if we're seeing that, this person can take video content as well. So that's a big thing. And then for some of them, we constantly get asked, like, how do I get to go fly in a fighter? How do I get to go up and do basically like a lot of things that I used to do? As I mentioned earlier, things have changed. It's not as easy today as it was back when I started doing this. There still are some opportunities to do it, but it's demonstrating that you have the capability as a photographer to do it, that you're professional on how you're approaching it. There's still those opportunities where we're seeing new photographers come in. I have one gentleman that he's been working full time for me now for 5 years, Lloyd Horgan, young guy. He came from nothing, and I gave him a chance, and he's one of the best aviation videographers and photographers that's out there in the world, because he was different on how he approached things. And I think that's the big thing, is that there's a part when you're an aviation photographer, is that you have to take the aviation enthusiasm part out of it and be a professional. And sometimes people can't draw that line of, how do I do this professionally? And it's not, I get to go fly in a helicopter, or, I get to go fly in this. That's just the tool that allows you to do what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that we're seeing some, the newer generation, if you want to call that are coming up. And there are some incredibly talented photographers out there. They surpass what I was able to do, but look at where technology is, where we talk about digital cameras.
Yeah.
And, you're taking hundreds of frames in one pass of an aircraft. So it's changed. So it allows you to do things that are different. So my number one piece of advice is be different.
Okay, Mike, that's going to wrap up our chat for today. I just want to thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy guy, so I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. I'm really looking forward to our partnership and all the great things that's going to bring. So thank you very much.
You know what? This has been it's been an honor to be on here and to tell a little bit about the story of how I got into this and a little bit about MHM Publishing. But like we said, this partnership that we have with the pilot project, we're excited by it, and there's going to be a lot of great opportunities that come from it.
Okay, that's going to wrap up our chat with Mike Reyno, all about his career in air-to-air photography with the RCAF, as well as all his publication efforts. For our next episode, we sit down with very special guest, Major General Chris McKenna, commander of 1 Canadian Air Division, for a super interesting 3-part series. Part 1 will feature our discussion on his career, including his early days in flight training, his tours in Afghanistan, as well as his time as the CO of 450 Tactical Helicopter Squadron, which is our Chinook Squadron. Do you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard in this show? Would you or someone you know make a great guest, or do you have a great idea for a show? You can reach out to us at thepilotprojectpodcast@gmail.com or on all social media at @podpilotproject. And be sure to check out that social media for lots of great videos of our RCAF aircraft. As always, we'd like to thank you for tuning in and ask for your help with the big 3. That's like and follow us on social media, share with your friends, and follow and rate us 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Keep the blue side up. See ya!
Engineer, shut down all 4.